Good morning, guys, and welcome out to Revolution. We're continuing on with our videos on Sinaiticus, and so this will be part 3. And so all we've done so far is we're just sort of laying a bit of a foundation, and so we don't want to miss anything. We don't want to start talking about technical issues when we haven't just examined some of the bog standard basics of what Sinaiticus is, and also popular opinion about what Sinaiticus is and how it functions in textual criticism. And so what we're doing at the moment is we're just going through a Wikipedia article, and we're going through and just looking at certain aspects of Sinaiticus and on a popular level. And so as we go through that, then we'll continue to go through and we'll do some readings of Sinaiticus as well. We'll continue to go through certain articles and examine certain claims that have come from the Textus Receptus King James only camp that have said that the Codex Sinaiticus is a modern day forgery. And so this argument is that Simonides, who was contemporary with many scribes of that era, he was known to be a forger. And so we're going to examine all these claims as well, because sometimes when someone has a certain opinion, we can throw them into a certain camp, which can taint what they're saying. So we're going to examine all the claims of his forgeries. We're going to look at all those sort of things. So we as we're going through the Wikipedia article, sometimes we're just rabbit trailing and going down the rabbit hole and looking at who, someone like Simonides is, or Tischendorf, and we're just examining these characters. And so we're building a bit of a foundation that we can build on. And so then we can get into some of the weeds that that is the main focus of this broadcast. And so here we have Sinaiticus here. And so this is claimed to be written in about 350 to 360 AD. And we got up to this section here. Scribes and correctors. So there was a large section that I did overlook, and that's just simply because to go through all this fine detail at the moment, we can later, is quite difficult. Sometimes as well, without having the correct text. See, one of the things is the Academy, they're trying to create the Bible. Okay, they believe that what we have at the moment is not sufficient, and they need to go out and find manuscripts and reread over certain documents and then create their text. Where we as received text advocates, we believe that the church has always had the Bible, and it hasn't needed to be updated, hasn't needed to be remade. Okay, so it's a bit like having a boat. So you might have a large boat, a fishing boat or something like that. Now, every now and then you might have to bring the boat into a dry dock and, paint the hull and scrape off a few barnacles here and there. And so that's what happened during the Reformation period. We saw it going from one technology to another. Now, the scriptures have gone through different technologies. There's different styles of writing. We've seen it go from full capital letters down to cursive letters. And so all of the manuscripts from that era exemplify the Byzantine text that went through that change. And also we saw in the Reformation period that manuscripts kind of became redundant with the era of printing. And so we see that people were looking at printed material rather than, going through manuscripts. And one of the things is, in all manuscripts there were variants. That was just a normal part of life back then. Just looking at any type of document, it's like if we were to look at something that was a 400-year-old printed document, we would expect that there's going to be a typo here and there. It was very difficult not to have a typo. People tried hard not to, but things crept in. And so people who are experts in these fields can recognize when there's typos and recognize in manuscripts where there are variants. And so people like Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, even the King James translators, all of these men were experts in their field. And so the technology went from manuscripts through to the printed text. And so we see the Textus Receptus, the first edition of the Greek New Testament. It was actually Aldus who did 6 chapters of the Gospels. I think that was in 1506. But then later on, the Complutensian Polyglot was made in 1514. So that was a team in Spain that made their text. 2 years later, Erasmus, he finished his first edition, and he went on to do 4 more editions. And so he did his first edition in 1516. Then he did one in 1519, 1522, 1527, and 1535. And then we see Stephanus, he took up the mantle. Now, there were a few other editions. There was the Wolf Cephalus edition at 1524. There's the Colonnaeus edition, 1534. There's the Cesar edition in 1538. But we see that in 1546, Stephanus did his first edition. Now, he did 3 other editions in 1549, 1550, and 1551. So his 1551 was the first one to introduce the numbering system. Now, because Stephanus was such a brilliant printer, he'd actually adopted, or he had invented, I guess you would say, in want of a better word, the concept to have everything numbered. And so he numbered, chapters were already numbered, probably about 200 or 300 years before. And even in the Bible, it does say things like the second psalm and things like that. So they worked upon that. But then Stephanus, in his 1551, he put the numbering system in there. So he also put a numbering system on a lot of ancient works, say like the Odyssey and things like that. He numbered those. So they're very helpful so that we don't have to go, well, just in this one chapter and wade through everything. We can just directly go straight to the reference number, which is very handy for us. We still use that type of system. And so that we saw Stephanus made 4 editions. Then we saw Theodore Beza. He did 5 editions. Now, the first edition he did was in 1556, and that was a Latin edition, but he had annotations at the bottom of the page that were annotations of the Greek. And so they were all in Latin as well, but he was talking about the Greek Bible there. So mostly he was using Stephanus's edition. And then in his 1565, his second edition, that was his first fully Greek edition. And he went on to do 1582, 1589, and 1598. So the 1598 was the main one that was used by the King James translators. So if you were to have some sort of AI bot that could absolutely perfectly translate, in a moment of time, the 1598, if you press translate, you would get the King James version apart from about 20 readings. And so the King James version is very, very close to the text of Beza. But those 20 readings warrant enough difference for the King James version to be called its own Textus Receptus edition. Just like Beza, he might have had certain differences between his 5 editions. And so there is slight variation. Most of these are well known. They're in the margin, in the annotations of Theodore Beza. And so what we see is the King James translators, they did their text, but they didn't do a parallel Greek text. What they did is they just did it in English and left it as that. So what happened was people, they were using the the 1550 of Stephanus, or the Elzevirs later on did a few editions, 1524, 1533, etc. So these became popular. So some people were using Beza, some people were using Elzevirs, some people were using Stephanus, but none of them were really 100% exactly like the King James. So what happened was when they were actually going to do a revision of the King James in 1881, so we look back in time and we see that these guys weren't really fit spiritually or academically to do this type of work, but they attempted to do it. They snuck in a new, never seen before Greek text, which is the Westcott and Hort text, which is what most Bibles are based upon today. And so what we see is in 1881, they wanted to show people exactly where they had departed from the Greek text. And so they said, look, the King James translators never did an edition of their Greek. They had their own Greek text, which was different to Beza in a few slight places. So Scrivener, he made that text. And so in 1881, he published that, and that is what the Trinitarian Bible Society print today as the Textus Receptus. So that's the closest that we have to the King James. Now, he said that the King James sort of departed, or there was 190 places where he needed to modify his Greek text to make it conform to the King James. Now, the vast majority of these are very unnecessary. They're just to do with phonetics. You might have a different spelling of a name, Jeremiah or Jeremiah. These are going to be translated as Jeremiah into English anyway. And so how he thought that these were different, I'm not sure. But I on my examination of Scrivener, I think that he actually didn't do the greatest job. He basically just got Beza's 1598 and amended a few places here and there. So that's why it looks like it's an amazing work, but really our hat needs to be taken off to Theodore Beza. And so the King James translators, they did their work. They compiled what I would say is the final edition of the Textus Receptus. When people like Mark Ward say, where is the TR? Well, clearly it's the 1598 of Beza, with about 20 differences, and that would be found in the King James. Now, people are so poisoned against the King James and against the Textus Receptus that when you say, well, the King James translators did their own textual criticism, no, I don't know anyone who's ever denied that these people have done textual criticism, Erasmus, Stephanus, but it's not modern textual criticism where you have the hardest reading is the best, and you only really go with the oldest manuscripts, or that they have this type of textual criticism that is just strange and bizarre. Most of the time, they're favoring Vaticanus and Sinaiticus above absolutely everything. So, when we go through what the King James translators did, they were well equipped to go through and formulate their text. Now, had any one of them, at Lancelot Andrews or John Boyce or Henry Saville, a lot of these men were very brilliant men. They could have easily, any one of them, produced their own Greek text, but they didn't. They just did the English Bible and they left it like that. And so that became the standard throughout the world. And so when we look at, say, the Bible societies, what they were to do, when the Bible Society started in 1504, they were to use the Textus Receptus Greek, but they were to also use the King James as their guide, and sort of use the King James as the final product. That's what they wanted the other Bibles to look like, and they were to use the Masoretic text, the Hebrew Masoretic text. And so what happened was in the Bible societies that started in 1804, there were so many Unitarians that came into the society that by 1831, they actually had a huge split, and people left that society and started the Trinitarian Bible Society because the normal Bible Society becomes so filled with Unitarians. Unitarians are sort of like Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't believe in the Trinity. They don't believe in the deity of Christ. And so then what you have is this type of influence spread through most of Europe in that time, specifically England. And so you have a lot of Unitarian influence. And so that's why even the Westcott and Hort text, they had Unitarians working with them. One of them was called George Vance Smith. And so he was working with Westcott and Hort, complete and utter heretic. I mean, you wouldn't get a Jehovah's Witness to help you with a text. But these guys had Unitarians working with them. And they even had communion with these people in the Church of England at the time. There was a massive upheaval about this. So we're talking about people who are deeply compromised, liberals, people who don't have, they only have an air of orthodoxy to sort of get their foot in the door of academic institutions. They're ticking the right boxes, but when you look and examine closely, these guys are deeply compromised with Unitarians and others. And so, but that's when they toppled the Textus Receptus in academia. And so it took quite a while for this to, for the ripple effects to go through into translations and things like that. But it wasn't long after that that the British and Foreign Bible Societies dropped the TR and they started going with the Nestle text. So the Nestle text was a combination of the Westcott and Hort text, Tischendorf's text, and the Weiss text. And they also incorporated the Weymouth text as well. So that's what the footnotes were, just showing the differences between those texts. And so eventually that came through a whole bunch of editions and came to the United Bible Society's text, the Nestle Aland group. So you had Kurt Aland. He got involved with this, and with Bruce Metzger and Carlo Martini. Now, Carlo Martini was in line. He's a Catholic. He was in line to be a pope. He was very famous, and he was part of the group. So there was a group of people who were deciding what the Bible would read. And so what they did is they got the text of Westcott and Hort and started again from that. So that was their main basis and foundation. And so then they moved through from that, which was in the, I'm pretty sure it was in the late 50s, early 60s. And so that went through till we have the Nestle Aland 28th edition. That's the latest one that's come out in in 2013. So that's 10 years old now. And we see other, Greek texts pop up every now and then, the Tyndale House text and others, and these become, sort of like fad Bibles, the SIL Bible and others. But say the Tyndale House text has 1,300 differences from the Nestle Aland. So which one is it? We were pointing out just differences in English Bibles were causing enough confusion, but now we see differences in Greek editions, and sometimes they're using the same sources, that they're looking at the same material, but they're just coming up with different information, which shows you that the textual criticism that's being used today is more so of an art form. It's not just like a complete science where you just add one element to the other and you get the solution. What we're seeing is people getting involved with this who having Carlo Martini as one of the main guys, one of the main architects for the Nestle Aland text, it just shows you the deep compromise of the Roman Catholic Church. In the 27th edition of the Nestle Aland text, they said that they are, I might actually get this up, they have a collusion with the Vatican. So I'll just type in so which is quite interesting when you examine these things. Okay, where are we? This one here. So this is in the 27th edition of the Nestle Aland text. It says the text shared by these two editions was adopted internationally by the Bible Society. So what you have is you have the United Bible Society text, and then you have the Nestle Aland text, and they were sort of almost competing with each other but now they're basically the same text. They might just have a different apparatus. So the following following an agreement between the Vatican and the United Bible Societies, it has served as the basis for new translations and for revisions made under their supervision. This marks a significant step with regard to interconfessional relationships. It should naturally be understood that this text is a working text in the sense of a century-long Nestle tradition. It is not to be considered as definitive, but as a stimulus to further efforts towards defining and verifying the text of the New Testament. For many reasons, however, the present edition has not been deemed an appropriate occasion for introducing textual changes. But here we clearly see that there is collusion between the Vatican and the United Bible Societies. And so this has been the cause of alarm for a lot of people. They're seeing deep compromise, not only with the translations being done, but with the underlying text. And many times there are complete verses taken out. And we see that there is an attack against those who hold to the received text, who just say, look, we just want to read the Bibles that are from the Reformation period. Now, that's usually a Textus Receptus stand. Other people go further and say, look, we want every jot and every tittle, and we believe that is represented in the decisions of the King James translators. Now, whether you follow Scrivener or whether you follow the English King James. See, the thing is, the King James only movement and the TR movement are basically the same thing. But the issue is the King James only movement has a whole heap of baggage on it. People like Ruckman and Ripplinger and Sam Gipp and others, many times these guys have tried hard to show where there's problems, like I've been pointing out, but sometimes they'll get into a bit of conspiracy kook land, you know what I mean, and Area 51 type of stuff. And so people have rejected them, but in so doing, what they've done is they've actually rejected the King James translators, who are brilliant men. And these people wanted to make one principal translation. For many good ones, they wanted to make one principal good one. And so they did that out of the English, out of all the foreign language editions, and out of the original tongues. They made one more exact edition. And so that's what it says, not in the preface to the reader, but in the dedication to the king. It actually says that. So we believe that has happened. And so the thing is, the King James only movement, it just has this baggage, usually of popular characters who, someone like James White and someone like Dan Wallace, they'll just keep bringing up these characters, and they'll only show them. They don't really want to show people who, have a sound mind and who are can articulate themselves, and who are just good pastors or whatever, or good leaders in churches. They don't want to show them. They want to show the kooky guys who jump on pulpits and scream and who are just obnoxious and toxic, and no one would really want to be a part of them. But so what we see is this division between the Textus Receptus groups and the King James groups. And some people do have a TR position where they adopt all the Greek of the Reformation era. I mean, there was no Vaticanus edition done back then. Everyone rejected Vaticanus. It was just seen as just a curiosity, like Codex Beza. That's the not Theodore Beza's work, but a manuscript that was named after him from the 5th century. And Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, which was later found, these have no children. There's just nothing that's made. There's no versions. There's no copying of those works. They're just sort of standalone editions, and they had to amalgamate these two, put them together to create this Frankenstein monster, which is the Westcott and Hort text. And that's why we're like, we don't want that. We want what the churches already had. And so what we see is the King James only movement, the Textus Receptus only movement. What it comes down to is the decisions made by the King James translators. We see that they are definitive. whether you're looking at the Textus Receptus edition of FHA Scrivener, or whether you're just looking at the English of the King James Bible, they're pretty much mirrors of each other. So, but at the end of the day, the King James translators, 99.99999% of their work is Beza. So we have this huge tradition going through the Reformation, which came out in Beza. The King James translators took their hat off to him and said, look, great job. There's only 20 places where we feel that we want to, amend a few things. And that's huge, where you've only got 20 differences between the King James and the text of Beza. And so Scrivener's done his work later on, and we can look at that in the Greek. I've got that sitting here. But at the end of the day, had the King James translators done a parallel text or an interlinear, or like the Plantin polyglot or the London polyglot or the Hutter or something like that, had they, put all these nuances and maybe chatted about them in annotations, we wouldn't have a separate TR group and a separate King James group. They're basically the same. And so that's the conclusion that I've come to after years and years and years of being of labeling myself a Textus Receptus person and having everyone label me a King James only to try and discredit me. It's a bit like, if you vote for certain people, you're a racist, or you're, just this sort of rhetoric, which is ridiculous. But they just throw me into the, like Mark Ward, he'll just say I'm a Ruckmanite. James White, the first time I ever talked to him, he said, you're a Ruckmanite. I'm like, the article that I sent you, James, just in the first few paragraphs, I talk against Ruckmanism. But, these people, they major in ad hom argumentation. And so in me trying not to be labeled the King James only guy, after a while, it was just people were just labeling me that. And I sort of realized, hang on, apart from a few, kooky characters here and there, I'm not really that worried about it anymore, because I'm aligning myself with the scholarship of the King James translators rather than, anyone, most of these people aren't even that interested in the King James translators who are the, the kooky types. They might mention them every now and then, but it's like, I'm deeply fascinated by these people and specifically their scholarship. But at the end of the day, it's what we're looking at is the pinnacle of the Reformation, the culmination of learning of the Reformation from Erasmus, Stephanus, Beza, and then to the King James translators. This is an amazing feat, and I don't mind being labelled with all those other guys, even though I'm not a Calvinist, even though I wouldn't agree with all the things in the Church of England at that time, or with all the politics that were happening. But I can recognize when someone's done a more superior job to someone else. You know what I mean? Like, no one's perfect. You look through the ages, you look through even the people in the Bible. I could say, well, Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter. Well, Peter was compromising with Jewish people, and Paul had to rebuke him. And well, we're living in a fallen world. But the thing is, God promised to preserve His word, and so we believe those words are preserved. And so I've gotten to the stage where whether I'm holding up, a King James Bible or I'm holding up the Textus Receptus, you're really splitting hairs with any type of difference. And most people have never gone and studied these things. They've just read books about them or listened to, controversial sayings about them, and with, a whole bunch of weasel words in there, like, oh, the King James translators did textual criticism, or Erasmus did textual criticism. It's like, who's saying they didn't? We're saying that they're not doing modern textual criticism with Vaticanus and Sinaiticus, and it's just these type of strange things that we constantly hear parroted. And unfortunately, it's the popular internet apologists like, James White, who these guys just constantly megaphone out this type of rhetoric. And so we just hear it reverberate back to us, and with just lay people, they're like, did you know that Erasmus did textual criticism? It's like, yeah. I'm pretty sure everyone in the TR KJV movement knows that. but James White's making out that it's just this, did you realize that happened? And it's like, well, why would you do that? And people are coming out and trying to prove that the Textus Receptus isn't based upon the majority text. Yeah, the majority text of the 1980s was a printed text. Before that, the Textus Receptus was actually named the majority text, simply because the alternative, the critical text, was called the minority text. So they're just labels. It doesn't mean it encompasses all truth. And so if you label something, it doesn't mean, if you say, oh, that's a Byzantine text, well, you can't really have a Byzantine text until the Byzantine Empire actually came. So when you find Byzantine readings in papyri, they go, you can't say it's Byzantine. So why not? Because the Byzantine Empire hadn't come around yet. Well, people have labeled something Byzantine, but it doesn't mean that they invented it. Or, people have these problems with categorizing things and labeling things. And so anyway, I just sort of throw that in the mix because some people don't know where I stand with all this. And sometimes it's good to be refreshed on these things. But so what happened in 1844 was the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus. And Codex Sinaiticus came on the scene. Many people were swayed to believe that this manuscript is like a missing link between the originals and what we have today, sort of thing. And so they wanted to throw out a lot of Textus Receptus readings and adopt Sinaiticus readings, and they also wanted to adopt Vaticanus readings. They believed that people of the Reformation era were wrong to reject it as just a corrupt manuscript. They wanted to exalt this as the best. So it went from the bottom of the barrel right to the top of the barrel all of a sudden. And so we're going to go through and we're going to look at this section here, which is scribes and correctors. So in the last two videos, we've gone through up till this point. So now we're going to look at scribes and correctors. So I'll just continue reading through here. If there's anything that I feel like I have to explain a little bit more, I'll go through that. And so we've got some comments here. So we've got Bob in the house. Hello there, Nick. Hope you're well. Yes, going good, Bob. Hope you're doing well. So scribes and correctors. I might see if I can enlarge in this a bit. If you're reading along, I know most people actually listen to this. Tischendorf believes, this is Wikipedia, Tischendorf believed that 4 separate scribes copied the work, whom he named A, B, C, and D, and 5 correctors amended portions, whom he designated A, B, C, D, and E. So in the first ones, A, B, C, D are in all capitals, and the 5 correctors are A, B, C, D, E in minuscule letters and small letters. He posited one of the correctors was contemporaneous with the original scribes, and the others worked during the 6th and 7th centuries. After Milne and Skeet's re-investigation, it is now agreed that Tischendorf was incorrect, as Scribe C never existed. According to Tischendorf, Scribe C wrote the poetic books of the Old Testament. These are written in a different format from the rest of the manuscript. They appear in 2 columns. The rest of the book is in 4 columns, written stichometrically. So let's look up stichometrically. Oops, there was a Wikipedia article on it, which would be better to read. Stichometry is the practice of counting lines in text. Ancient Greeks and Romans measured the length of their books in lines, just as modern books are measured in pages. The practice was rediscovered by German and French scholars in the 19th century. Stikos, plural, stikoi, is the Greek word for a line of prose or poetry, and the suffix metri is derived from the Greek word for measurement. And so every now and then I'll just look up one of these words, so we don't just get we sometimes you can read half a paragraph, and one word like this can just make you go, what were they talking about? So that was just a lot of these highfalutin words are very simple. What I find with a lot of text criticism, they have a lot of highfalutin words like this, which are fine. We need words which describe things accurately, but most of the time it's just lines that they count. You know what I mean? It's not. You don't have to be a savant to figure these type of things out. Tischendorf probably interpreted the different formatting as indicating the existence of another scribe. The three remaining scribes are still identified by the letters Tischendorf gave them, A, B, and D. So these other guys, Milne and Skeet, came along. They said, we don't think C existed. So they've just gone with A, B, and D. Okay. There were, in fact, more correctors with at least 7. So now they've got A, B, C, CA, CB, and CC, and E. So interesting. Do I agree with all that? I'm not sure. We'll see. Modern analysis identifies 3 scribes. Scribe A wrote most of the historical and poetical books of the Old Testament, almost the whole of the New Testament, and the Epistle of Barnabas. Scribe B was responsible for the prophets and the Shepherd of Hermes. Scribe D wrote the whole book of Tobit and Judith and the first half of 4 Maccabees, the first 2/3 of the Psalms, and the first 5 verses of Revelation. That's interesting. Only the first 5 verses of Revelation. How they can tell this? Well, this is, by handwriting experts, people looking at how manuscripts are written. They can see certain patterns and certain letters that are a certain way. Scribe B was a poor speller, and Scribe A was not much better. The best scribe was D. Metzger states Scribe A had made some unusually serious mistakes. Scribe A and B used nomina sacra in contracted forms, most often pneuma contracted in all occurrences, kurios contracted except in 2 occurrences, whereas Scribe D mostly used the uncontracted forms. So that's interesting. Scribe D distinguished between sacral and non-sacral uses of kurios. So what it's talking about there is sacral and non-sacral uses of kurios. So sometimes we see that someone is just called kurios. Kurios in Greek just means sir as well as lord or master. So you might have someone say, kurios, and they're talking to a Roman soldier, or Jesus is talking about a parable, and he's talking about a farmer or something. So he might use the word kurios. And so Scribe D distinguishes between sacral, between, when it's talking about Jesus or Jehovah God, or, Jesus is Jehovah the Son, but talking about Jesus or talking about the Father, sacral and non-sacral. So basically holy and non-holy uses of kurios. And so hopefully you guys are following that. If there's anything that I read through and you're like, can you just explain that? I'll go through and I'll explain it. His spelling errors are the substitution of epsilon iota for iota. And so, sometimes he'll be going through, and where it should be epsilon iota, sometimes he just puts iota, and iota for epsilon iota in medial positions, both equally common. So just going to quickly look up medial. So the middle position. Okay. Otherwise, substitution for iota for initial epsilon iota is unknown, and final epsilon iota is only replaced in the word is. That's a hard word to pronounce. Is hui. Let's look it up. If I can't pronounce anything in Greek, what I do is I go to Google Translate, throw it in, detect language. It'll go straight to Greek, and then we can go.
Is he? Is he?
Is he? So it's a very good way just to. Sometimes when you hear it, you're like, "Ah, it's that word," you know. But this means to apply, so it's not a familiar word to me. The confusion of epsilon and alpha iota is very rare. In the book of Psalms, the scribe has Daud, so for David instead of Daid, 35 times, while scribe A normally uses an abbreviation form of delta, alpha, delta with the nomenclature line above it. Scribe A made the most phonetic errors. Confusion of epsilon and alpha iota occurs in all contexts. Milne and Skeet characterized scribe B as careless and illiterate. The work of the original scribe is designated by the siglum, and that's the Hebrew letter Aleph. Okay, so usually when you see this, it just means Sinaiticus. Okay, so it's just the heap. It's just sometimes they give manuscripts numbers. They do give this manuscript a number, but sometimes they give them symbols as well. And so a paleographical study at the British Museum in 1938 found the text had undergone several corrections. The first corrections were done by several scribes before the manuscript left the scriptorium. Readings which they introduced were designated by the siglum Aleph, and then with a little A there, a Latinized A. So usually you would see Aleph for the first writer, and then you see Aleph A for the corrector. Okay, so this, I'm just pointing out these things because later on we're going to be dealing with some technical stuff, and it's going to look all crazy, but hopefully this helps. Milne and Skeet have observed the subscription to First Maccabees was made by Scribe D, while the text was written by Scribe A. Scribe D corrects his own work and that of Scribe A, but Scribe A limits himself to correcting his own work. In the 6th or 7th century, many alterations were made, and so then we have Aleph and a B. So this, people say, well, this is the 6th or 7th century. We don't know that for sure. These are just scholarly guesses. Okay. Now, whenever I'm saying, okay, in the 5th century there, 6th century there, 7th century, you know, a lot of the time, manuscripts that have been proven to be forgeries, that they have these elaborate stories about, oh, this manuscript, you know, back in the day, you know, back in the 10th century, this manuscript, they corrected it, and this other person, you know, decorated some of the letters in the 11th century and did all this, and then you find out it's a fake, it's a fraud. And so where did they come up with all these elaborate stories about this, like the Alans with archaic mark? They thought it was a wonderful manuscript until it was proven to be a forgery about 10 years ago. They found Prussian blue ink in it, which is a modern ink, and so they realized that it wasn't 13th century like they thought it was. They thought it was a 13th century manuscript, which was very close to Vaticanus, but it was actually a copy of a modern printed text. So in this, when I'm saying in the 6th or 7th century, I mean, as we're going to go through, because we're going to look at and see if this is a forgery or not, you know, so is this just a modern day forgery or is it old? But at the end of the day, we really everyone on all sides take all this by faith. because I know there are some people who have read a lot into, the concept of it being a forgery. And I know there are others who they believe it's a genuine document. But at the end of the day, until this is scientifically tested, we're all sort of a little bit in the dark. Now, we're trying to find clues that point to it being a modern-day forgery. Now, my presupposition is that I think it is a modern-day forgery, but I'm trying not to let those presuppositions get in the way of just looking at these things and going, well, perhaps in the 6th or 7th century, alterations were made. I mean, but at the end of the day, everyone in the Textus Receptus, King James Version camp reject Codex Sinaiticus, either just on the principles that were laid down by people like Dean John William Burgon. He said Vaticanus and Sinaiticus are two of the most corrupt manuscripts he's ever seen, and he called them scandalous. So, regardless of whether it's a forgery or not, we still think these are poor manuscripts. And also the thing is, Marcion in the early church, in one of the early church writers, he was corrupting the Bible very early. So who's to say that these aren't just corruptions of the Bible from some group, But anyway, let's continue through this. In the 6th or 7th century, many alterations were made. So we got Aleph and B, according to a colophon. So show you what a colophon is. In publishing, a colophon is a brief statement containing information about the publication of a book, such as an imprint in place of publication, the publisher, and the date of publication. So we've got this fancy colophon there. So it's just basically like a symbol that people used. According to a colophon, but it's not actually just a symbol. It is a colophon may include the device logo of a printer or publisher. Colophons are traditionally printed at the end of books. See history below for the origin of the word, but sometimes the same information appears elsewhere when it may still be referred to as a colophon, and many modern post-1800 books bear this information on the title page or the verso of the title leaf. So we might go just to the history. The term colophon derives from the late Latin colophon, from the Greek colophon, meaning summit or finishing touch. The term colophon was used in 1729 as the biographic explication at the end of the book by the English printer Samuel Palmer in his book. I won't name all that. After the colophon had been the common designation for the final page, that gives details of the physical creation of the book. The existence of colophons can be dated back to antiquity. Zetzel, for example, describes an inscription from the 2nd century AD transmitted in humanistic manuscripts. He cites the colophon of Poggio's manuscript, a humanist from the 15th century. A common colophon at the end of hand copy manuscripts was simply finished. Thank God. Okay, so it's just like these are just final notes. I guess it's like in modern verbiage, we would say postscriptum, PS at the end of a letter, sort of thing. So according to a colophon at the end of the book of Esdras and Esther, the source of these alterations was a very ancient manuscript that had been corrected by the hand of the holy martyr Pamphilus, martyred in 309. If this is so, material beginning with 1 Samuel to the end of Esther is Origen's copy of the Hexapla. Okay, so let me just read through that again, because we don't want to rush through anything. We want to fully understand it. So it says there's a colophon at the end of the book of Esdras and Esther. The source of these alterations was a very ancient manuscript that had been corrected by the hand of the holy martyr Pamphilus. So he was martyred in 309. So if this is so, material beginning with 1 Samuel to the end of Esther is Origen's copy of the Hexapla. So what the Hexapla was, you had a 6 parallel edition done by Origen. And so I'll just see if there's like a picture, a Hexapla fragment. And so you had maybe a summary would be better. Yeah, I think I'll just read it. I was trying to avoid this picture, but Hexapla, ancient Greek, means sixfold. So people would say that like the 5th column of Origen's Hexapla is the modern day Septuagint, the LXX. So it is a critical edition of the Hebrew Bible in 6 versions, 4 of them translated into Greek, preserved only in fragments. It was an immense and complex word-for-word comparison of the original Hebrew scriptures with the Greek Septuagint translation and with other Greek translations. The term especially and generally applies to the edition of the Old Testament compiled by the theologian and scholar Origen sometime before 240 AD. The subsiding fragments of partial copies have been collected in several editions, that of Frederick Field, 1875, being the most fundamental on the basis of Greek and Syrian testimonies. The surviving fragments now being republished with additional materials discovered since Field's edition by an international group of Septuagint scholars. This work is being carried out as the Hexapla Project. I might go there. Under the auspices of the international. So yeah, there's a bunch of people involved with that. So they've got the Hexapla Institute. So it looks like it's shut down, but they've got this in the Wayback Machine. Yeah, so anyway, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. So yeah, I guess it's giving people some work. John Mead was part of that, so he's part of the Texan Canon Institute. Yeah, so anyway, just so you know what's going on there. So they're saying from Esther to, or beginning with 1 Samuel to Esther is Origen's copy of the Hexapla. So from this colophon, so from the final writings at the end of this, the corrections are concluded to have been made in the Caesarea Maritima. So this is basically like a port city. Sort of, it was part of Israel in the 6th or 7th century. So I might just show you where that is. I think we looked at it last time, but a map often will show you in your mind. So here we are. You got Israel here. So I think it's near Tyre, or anyway, it's along the coast there, possibly near modern day like Tel Aviv. Okay, so let's continue. So they're saying that some corrections were made there in the 6th or 7th century. So they're saying that this manuscript was there. Okay. The persuasive ioticism, especially for the epsilon iota diphthong, remains uncorrected. So ioticism is when you have the letter iota. So let me read this article here. Ioticism, Greek iota kismos, or itachism, is the process of a vowel shift by which a number of vowels and diphthongs converged toward the pronunciation. In post-classical Greek and modern Greek, the term ioticism refers to the letter iota, or the original sign for iota, with which these vowels came to merge. The alternative term Itachism refers to the new pronunciation of the name of the letter eta as ita after the change. And so what happens in the Greek language is if you can have two letters that join together, two vowels that join together, and they create a different sound. And so you might have the B sound, but we know in modern Greek it's a V sound. So we would say vita, not beta. But if you want the beta sound, you have to have a mu, and I can't remember what the other letter is. I think it's a tau. And so actually my website, johannine.com. So if you look up the name of Georgios Babiniotis here, now if we go to his website, and you just look at the way that his name, like the whole website's here in Greek, but yeah, you see that the mu and the p here create a B sound. It's quite interesting. So maybe I can find, yeah. So look at on the cover here, he has the gamma for Georgios dot, and then that says Babiniotis. Now we would say that's an M-P-A-M, MPM, but it's Bab. So it's quite interesting. And so diphthongs are very important when you're trying to pronounce Greek, because a lot of people, they can pronounce like an Erasmian. Basically, Erasmian, the Erasmian twang is just sort of like, it's become American without diphthongs. Some people will use diphthongs, say angelos for angel. When you have two gammas together, it creates a diphthong, which is like an N. So we say, we don't say angelos, we say angelos. Okay. But you can see in Georgios Babiniotis's name, his last name is spelled with like a mu and a p. It's like, and that creates a distinct B sound, because if he had the vita there, it would be Georgios Vaviniotis. Now, when I first started talking to him, I heard his name phonetically. I'm like, oh, Georgios Vaviniotis, but he was clearly Georgios Babiniotis, because these two words create that diphthong, which these two letters create that sound. Okay, so I've just got to be careful, because I'm not specifically talking about vowels here, but I just thought I'd point that out, because what you have is the modern day text scholar uses the Erasmian twang, when the Reuchlinian was the modern Greek. So Reuchlin, he was instrumental in the revision of scholars speaking in modern Greek as it was pronounced, 400 or 500 years ago. So that was called Reuchlinian. So if anyone asks you, which language are you learning, or which style of Greek are you learning? Are you learning Erasmian? Just say, no, I'm studying Reuchlinian from Johann Reuchlin. So he was the one who provided Erasmus with certain manuscripts. So anyway, I've fully rabbit trailed down here, but so these people on Wikipedia are saying the persuasive ioticism, especially the epsilon iota diphthong, remains uncorrected. So there's some errors that have to do with this diphthong there. The codex may have been seen in 1761 by the Italian traveler Vitellino Donati. Okay, so this is him here. Born in Padua in Italy, was an Italian doctor, archaeologist, and botanist. So Notice it may have been. When he visited St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai in Egypt, his diary was published in 1879, in which it was written, I won't read through that in Australian Italian. In this monastery, I found a great number of parchment codices. There are some which seem to have been written before the 7th century, and especially a Bible made of beautiful vellum, very large, thin, and square parchments, written in round and very beautiful letters. Moreover, there are also in the church a Greek Evangelistarum in gold and round letters. It should be very old. Okay, so this is his diary. So someone's found his old diary. This is a guy in 1761. So he doesn't, I guess there's no way of saying Codex Sinaiticus back then, but people are retroactively looking back at this and saying, well, perhaps, he saw that document. So that's of interest. The Bible on beautiful vellum may be Codex Sinaiticus, and the gold Evangelisterium is likely Lectionary 300 on the Gregory Aland list. So let's have a look at number 300 here. So all the lectionaries are Byzantine. So there's no pictures of this. But actually, oh no, it's just in the list. So yes, but that's another one. So he's saying the Bible on beautiful vellum might be Codex Sinaiticus. The gold Evangelistarum is likely Lectionary 300. So it probably had some gold letters and things like that. So German biblical scholar Konstantin von Tischendorf wrote about his visit to the monastery in Ries in den Orient in 1846, translated as Travels in the East in 1847, without mentioning the manuscript. Later in 1860, in his writings about the Sinaiticus discovery, Tischendorf wrote a narrative about the monastery and the manuscript that spanned from 1844 to 1859. He wrote that in 1844, during his first visit to St. Catherine's Monastery, he saw some leaves of parchment in a waste basket. They were rubbish, which was to be destroyed by burning it in the ovens of the monastery, although this is firmly denied by the monastery. Another examination, he realized that there were parts of the Septuagint written in an early Greek uncial manuscript. He retrieved from the basket 129 leaves in Greek, which he identified as coming from a manuscript of the Septuagint. He asked if he might keep them, but at this point the attitude of the monks changed. They realized how valuable these old leaves were, and Tischendorf was permitted to take only 1/3 of the whole, that is 43 leaves. These leaves contain portions of 1 Chronicles, Jeremiah, Nehemiah, and Esther. After this return, they were deposited in the Leipzig University Library, where they remain. In 1846, Tischendorf published their contents, naming them the Codex Frederico Augustinus in honor of Frederick Augustus, in keeping secret the source of the leaves. Other portions of the same codex remained in the monastery, containing all of Isaiah, 1st and 4 Maccabees. So, okay, so let's just have a bit of a brief over this, okay? So, in his book in 1846, which was translated in 1847, he didn't mention his discoveries. So in 1860, that's when he mentions in his writings about the Sinaitic discovery. And so he wrote a narrative from 1844 to 1859. So he read that in 1844. That's when he saw it in the waste paper basket. So there is a whole contention where people are saying, "Oh, it wasn't found in a waste paper basket." Now, obviously, Tischendorf was probably lying through his teeth. Okay, but we've got to examine those things as well. But the strange thing is, for KJV people, is James White. He simply doesn't acknowledge that Tischendorf got it from a waste paper basket when he clearly said that he did. He's just like, it never came from a waste paper basket. And it's like, well, that's not our claim. Tischendorf said that. You know what I mean? So anyway, it's just a strange thing. And even James Snap Jr. has done, a few articles on this, just saying, why won't James White just, it's a bit like, John MacArthur with his whole thing of the blood of Jesus or the death of Jesus. It's like, why wouldn't he just make a distinction there? Why does he always have to conflate the two and be heretic? After examination, he realized they were part of the Septuagint. Okay, so he had 129 leaves in Greek. So he said this from the Septuagint. So he asked if he could keep them. He was permitted to take only 1/3 of the whole, so 43 leaves. Okay. So then they're put in Leipzig, so that's in Germany. Okay. It's one of the oldest German university libraries, so it's a bit like the British Library or something like that. It's very well maintained library. So in 1846, Tischendorf, he published the contents, naming them Codex Frederico Augustinus. So sometimes we'll see this as we're going along as one of the names of Sinaiticus. So it's named Codex Frederico Augustinus after this guy. So we may as well have a good look at who he is, since we're going to be naming him a bit. So the King of Saxony, a member of the House of Wettin. So, yeah, I guess it's like, if I found a manuscript and I named it, after King Charles or something like that. It's just what they did back then in Europe. I'll just shut some of this down. So other portions of the same codex remained in the monastery, containing all of Isaiah and 1st and 4th Maccabees. So then there was another guy who came on the scene, Uspensky. So we're going to look at him. And what I'm going to do, I'll read through this, and then we want to look at Tischendorf. Okay. And so because he's been introduced here, so we'll go through Uspensky. We'll just sort of brief over this time period, and then we'll get it a little bit into detail of some of the characters involved. So in 1845, Archimandrite Porphyrius Uspensky, so that's a nice picture of him there, living the dream. From 1804 to 1885, at that time, the head of the Russian ecclesiastical mission in Jerusalem and subsequently Bishop of Chigirin visited the monastery, and the codex was shown to him, together with leaves which Tischendorf had not seen. In 1846, Captain C.K. MacDonald visited Mount Sinai, saw the codex, and brought 2 codices, 498. That is minuscule 498 and 496 from the monastery. So he saw the codex, and he bought a couple of manuscripts, which were sort of unrelated manuscripts. So he bought 2 of them. In 1853, Tischendorf revisited the St. Catherine's Monastery to get the remaining 86 folios, but without success. Returning in 1859, this time under the patronage of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, he was shown Codex Sinaiticus. He would later claim to have found it discarded in a rubbish bin. This story may have been a fabrication, or the manuscripts in question may have been unrelated to Codex Sinaiticus. Reverend J. Sylvester Davies in 1863 quoted a monk of Sinai who stated that according to the librarian of the monastery, the whole Codex Sinaiticus had been in the library for many years and was marked in the ancient catalogues. It is not likely that a manuscript known in the library catalogue would have been jettisoned in the rubbish basket. Indeed, it has been noted that the leaves were in suspiciously good condition for something found in the trash. So it's these type of things that cause people to go, why is it in such good condition? Why, there's a clip by the BBC. If you type in BBC Codex Sinaiticus, you'll see this clip. Now, anytime someone shows it on one of these videos, their video gets flagged for copyright. Okay, so I won't show it. But if you look at that, they're with their bare hands just flipping through it. It's like we used to get these big newspapers when I was living in Melbourne called The Age, and here in New South Wales you have the Sydney Morning Herald, and they used to be huge. So you'd be on a train and you'd be holding it out like this, So, but people would just be rough with it. They'd turn a page like this. You can tell they're being quite rough with it, and it's like, is this really a 1600-year-old document? Is this really that old? There are a lot of things that cause people to just say, hey, we think this is modern. And so anyway, we've had a few people looking at it, and a few people sort of trying to examine it. Now this guy, Reverend J. Sylvester Davies, so he said he quoted a monk of Sinai. So notice he doesn't have the proof of this. He's just quoting a monk. So he stated that in accordance with the librarian of the monastery, the whole Codex Sinaiticus had been in the library for many years and was marked in the ancient catalogues. It is not likely that a manuscript known in the library catalogue would have been jettisoned in the rubbish basket. So you have these type of stories, but unless they really have it marked in ancient categories, you can't really rely on this. It's just someone saying a monk told him this. Okay, so who is this guy? So this is the thing. A lot of people who are pro Sinaiticus would go, why wouldn't you trust him? And it's like, okay, well, why would we trust it? So it just depends on which side you're on, what your presuppositions are. But let's have a look at who this guy is. There's actually not that much about him. Anyway, I think that it's not highlighted there. Okay, there is a footnote here. Davis's work from a letter published in The Guardian. So what happened was the Guardian newspaper, they started to run this story that Codex Sinaiticus could be a forgery. And so these were the claims of a guy called Constantine von Tischendorf. And, Constantine Simonides. Sorry, they got the same first name but not last name. And von just means like, it's just a fancy name for saying like sir, Sir Isaac Newton or something like that. Constantine von Tischendorf, and you had Constantine von Simonides. So Davis's words were from a letter published in The Guardian in 1863, as quoted by Eliot J.K. in 1982 in Codex Sinaiticus and the Simonides Affair, Thessaloniki, Patriarchal Institute for Patristic Studies. So yeah, that is going back to The Guardian, 1863, but also it's mentioned in a book in 1982 about Codex Sinaiticus and the Simonides Affair. So that would be an interesting book to get a hold of. or it might just be an article. Okay, maybe it's actually online. Doesn't look like we can read it. Codex Sinaiticus and the Simonides Affair, an examination of a 19th century claim that Codex Sinaiticus was not an ancient manuscript. So that's in 1982. So this is very early on. So people are like, well, it's just a King James only conspiracy, da-da-da. It might be considered a conspiracy, but it's like a conspiracy theory. But at the end of the day, there were these scholars writing books about it in 1982. Okay, so Tischendorf had been sent to search for manuscripts by the Russia's Tsar Alexander II, who was convinced there were still manuscripts to be found in the Sinai monastery. The text of this part of the codex was published by Tischendorf in 1862. It was called Constantine von Tischendorf Bibliorum Codex Sinaiticus Petropolitanus, 1862. It was in Leipzig. The work has been digitized in full, and all 4 volumes may be consulted online. So to open that up, it was reprinted in 4 volumes in 1869. So you have all those there. I'll just check that link out. The complete publication of the Codex was made by Kersop Lake in 1911, New Testament, and 1922, Old Testament. It was the full-size black and white facsimile of the manuscript, made from negatives taken from St. Petersburg by my wife and myself in the summer of 1908. Okay, so we can browse through the book here. And this is one of the things. So back then, they couldn't have the type of access that we have to a lot of manuscripts nowadays, where this was all just sort of in black and white, pictures. Some people would just put this thing together sometimes. So I'll just try and zoom this. So yeah, we can see it there. Very interesting. Looks like the end of the book of John, I think. Anyway, so that is part of that. So I'll put that link in the description there, in the chat actually. I don't think that helped. Anyway, you can see where I got it from. Go to Wikipedia, and you can see its number, like, where was it? 101 here. Okay. The complete publication of the Codex was made by Kersop Lake. I read that. The story of how Tischendorf found the manuscript, which contained most of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament, has all the interest of a romance. So you have people like Dan Wallace say that Tischendorf was like, it was like the Raiders of the Lost Ark type of thing. He was going around finding antiquities and, running from certain people. And, he was a real Indiana Jones type of guy. And so, people from the critical text side love to romanticize about him, that he was a bit of a hero. And so we're going to look at all those claims about his own character and things like that. We want to examine him and examine what he was good at, because we don't want to just, demonize people and just because they're on the other side. Just like these guys do with Erasmus. What they do is they just get these people and turn them into the Three Stooges, the Erasmus, Stephanus, and Beza. They're just slapping each other on the head, and they're slipping on banana peels, and they're falling off the roof, and they're going through their scriptorium with all the letters in Greek on one side, and they fall over, and it all ends up on the ground, and they go, oh, just put it all back together, and that they make out that these guys were just buffoons, and so we don't want to commit that same sin. We're Christians, we're not slanderers, and so oftentimes I find I'm dealing with people who are slanderers, and they don't like to just be truthful and honest about historical events and facts and figures, and they just like to demonize and have ad hominem argumentation. Tischendorf reached the monastery on the 31st of January, but his inquiries appeared to be fruitless. On the 4th of February, he had resolved to return home without having gained his object. On the afternoon of this day, I was taking a walk with the steward of the convent in the neighborhood, and as we returned towards sunset, he begged me to take some refreshment with him in his cell. Scarcely had he entered the room when, resuming our former subject of conversation, he said, "And I too have read a Septuagint," that is, a copy of the Greek translation made by the 70. And so saying, he took down from the corner of the room a bulky kind of volume wrapped up in a red cloth and laid it before me. I unrolled the cover and discovered, to my great surprise, only those very fragments which 15 years before I had taken out of the basket, but also other parts of the Old Testament, the New Testament complete, and in addition the Epistle of Barnabas and a part of the Shepherd of Hermes. So that's the official type of story of how. So basically, what you have is Tischendorf saying he first went there, saw they were burning this thing, and people were like, this wouldn't even burn well, But so he rescued it and then grabbed a whole bunch of stuff, and then when he came back, someone gave him like a whole bunch of the rest of it, including the New Testament and things like that. So after some negotiations, he obtained possession of this precious fragment. James Bentley gives an account of how this came about, prefacing it with the comment, Tischendorf therefore now embarked on the remarkable piece of duplicity which was to occupy him for the next decade, which involved the careful suppression of facts and the systematic denigration of the monks of Mount Sinai. He conveyed it to Tsar Alexander II, who appreciated its importance and had it published as nearly as possible in facsimile, so as to exhibit correctly the ancient handwriting. In 1869, the Tsar sent the monastery 7,000 rubles and the monastery of Mount Tabor 2,000 rubles by way of compensation. Okay, so that's Kersop Lake mentions that, and D.C. Parker. So D.C. Parker, he's been involved with the Tyndale House text, so he has examined Sinaiticus personally and looked at it and all the rest of it. The document in Russian formalizing this was published in 2007 in Russia and has since been translated. And so, okay, so we've got a picture here. The Chapel of the Burning Bush in St. Catherine's Monastery, a lithograph from the album of Porphyrius Uspensky. So Uspensky, he went there and he ended up with this picture. It's a little bit blurry. I'll just bring that down to size there. So it's a very religious type of thing, a lot of mats around, a few pictures of different people. And so you can imagine in this place, there would just be a labyrinth of different rooms. And sometimes they're going to do an extension of a room and they break down a wall and they find, 50 manuscripts. And this sort of thing's happening all the time here. It's a very old building. So let's just continue on. The codex is regarded by the monastery as having been stolen, which is proven by a receipt given by Tischendorf to the authorities at the monastery, promising to return the manuscript from St. Petersburg to the Holy Confraternity of Sinai at its earliest request, a copy of which is on display in the publicly accessible area of the monastery. So right in the public area in the monastery, they have, the letter saying that Tischendorf was supposed to return this. And so obviously most of it's in the British Library. When Stalin started to get a bit broke, he sold it, his part of it, to the British, and they have it in the British Library opposite the White Album from the Beatles. This view of Tischendorf's role in the transfer to St. Petersburg has been contested by several scholars in Europe. New Testament scholar Bruce Metzger wrote, certain aspects of the negotiations leading to the transfer of the Codex to the Tsar's possession are open to an interpretation that reflects adversely on Tischendorf's candor and good faith with the monks at St. Catherine's Monastery. For an account intended to exculpate him from blame, see Everhard Luke's article. He's got all this German writing. For an account that includes a hitherto, that is before 1964, unknown receipt given by Tischendorf to the authorities at the monastery, promising to return the manuscript from St. Petersburg to the Holy Confraternity of Sinai at its early request. So that's Bruce Metzger, roughly around 1964, writing about this issue. So then we're going to enter into Simonides, but first off, we want to back up. We want to check out who these guys are. So let's have a quick look at Tischendorf. And we'll refresh ourselves about who Tischendorf was, okay, and what he did. And so Konstantin von Tischendorf, so his full name is Lobegot Frederick Konstantin von Tischendorf, 18th of January 1815 to the 7th of December 1874, was a German biblical scholar. In 1844, he discovered the world's oldest and most complete Bible, dated to around the mid-4th century, called Codex Sinaiticus, after St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai, where Tischendorf discovered it. Tischendorf was made an honorary doctor by the University of Oxford on the 16th of March 1865, and the University of Cambridge on the 9th of March 1865, following his discovery. While a student gaining his academic degree in the 1840s, he earned international recognition when he deciphered the Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus, a 5th century Greek manuscript of the New Testament. So Ephraemi Rescriptus was a palimpsest which had faint writing in the background. So it had basically faint writing in the background, and someone had written over it. And so he was able to decipher the faint writing in the background, where a lot of people had tried and failed. So he was successful in doing that. So that brought him into international fame. So he's about 59 when he died, and so he died in Germany. So he's a German guy. Tischendorf was born in Langenfeld, Saxony, near Poland, the son of a physician. Beginning in 1834, he spent his scholarly career at the Library of Leipzig, where he was mainly influenced by G.J.B. Weiner. So that's interesting. I'm pretty sure Weiner was he was the guy who wrote a lot of Greek grammars. I might just check on that, because he's not. I do remember the name Weiner being constantly brought up when talking about like Greek articles and Granville Sharp issues. And okay, yeah, so he's got some works out there. Yeah, so A.T. Robinson, he mentions him. Linguistic Analysis of the Greek New Testament, Studies and Tools. Yeah, so he sounds like he was part of academia with the Greek Greek language, and so, but it says that he was a Unitarian. That's interesting. It says theologically, Weiner was an anti-Trinitarian. So A.T. Robinson mentions that. So that's interesting. Because one of the amazing things that David Cloud said when he went to see Codex Sinaiticus in the British Library, he said there was quite a big line to look at it, and he realized that the group that was in front of him was a busload of Jehovah's Witnesses. And he said it sort of dawned on him that these people see this manuscript as like a bit of it's like a pilgrimage to go and see it, because it favors them. It favors their Bible, the New World Translation as well. It's not just the whole evangelical Protestant type of thing. This is a cult going, Westcott and Hort nailed it. They were able to, get Tischendorf's work and create the manuscript or create the Westcott and Hort text. And so here they are looking at Codex Sinaiticus like, this saved us from the horrible shackles of the Textus Receptus. It's like, it's a huge thing, what's happened. And so it was quite interesting that David Cloud just so happened to see this busload of Jehovah's Witnesses like doing their little pilgrimage to it. Okay, so we're looking at Tischendorf. There's his signature there. So he was mainly influenced by this anti-Trinitarian guy, which is quite interesting. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a Trinitarian. I mean, there are some people that we all have on our bookshelf that we're like, I don't know who this guy is, or but he's interesting, he's intellectual, and sometimes they say a lot of right things. But was there a transference of spirit there? And he began to take special interest in New Testament criticism, which is, anti-Trinitarianism. Unitarianism seems to, it directs people in that way. Weiner's influence gave him the desire to use the old manuscripts in order to compile the text of the New Testament as close as the original as possible. Well, it sounds like he had quite an influence on him. I'll just open that page anyway. In 1838, he took the degree of Doctor of Philosophy and became master at a school near Leipzig. After a journey through southern Germany and Switzerland and a visit to Strasbourg, he returned to Leipzig to begin on a critical study of the New Testament text. So his career, in 1840, he qualified as a university lecturer in theology with a dissertation on the recensions of the New Testament text, the main part of which reappeared the following year in the Prolegomena to his first edition of the Greek New Testament. These early textual studies convinced him of the absolute necessity of new and more exact collations of manuscripts. So collations are just when you get manuscripts and you put them into like a typeset. You point out where there are issues. You just basically talk about what's in a handwritten document. So the words, changes, certain abnormalities, things crossed out, things like that. From October 1840 until January 1843, he was in Paris, busy with the treasures of the Bibliothèque Nationale, eking out his scanty means by making collations for other scholars and producing for the publisher Firmin Didot. Okay. Several editions of the Greek New Testament, one of them exhibiting the form of the text corresponding closely to the Vulgate. His second edition retracted the more precarious readings of the first and included a statement of critical principles that is a landmark for evolving critical studies of biblical texts. Okay, so in his early career, he's working for a few other people. He's doing a bit of work for some other guys. It seems like he's trying to make ends meet by doing this. I will open this firm Didot. He's a French printer. Okay, and so they're working on sort of like Vulgate manuscripts and things like that. So okay. A great triumph of these laborious months was the decipherment of the palimpsest Codex Ephremi Syri Rescriptus, of which the New Testament part was printed before he left Paris, and the Old Testament in 1845. His success in dealing with the manuscript that, having been written over with other works of Ephraim the Syrian, had been mostly illegible to earlier collators. It made him more well known and gained support for more extended critical expeditions. So he's worked on this Codex Ephremi Syri Rescriptus. It's put him on the map, and people are like, well, let's support this guy. And so he now became Professor Extraordinarius at Leipzig, where he was married in 1845. He also began to publish Reisen den Orient, an account of his travels in the East, in 2 volumes, 1845 to 1846, translated as Travels in the East in 1847. Even though he was an expert in reading the text of a palimpsest, this is a document where the original writing has been removed and new writing added. So that's what I was talking about, the palimpsest. Sometimes they would have the old ink on there and they'd scrape it all off and they'd write over it like it's a new sheet of paper. But with ultraviolet technology nowadays, a lot of the time you can see this behind the text. So with this, he was not able to identify the value or meaning of the Archimedes palimpsest, a torn leaf which he held, and after his death was sold to the Cambridge University Library. So he had this in his possession, the Archimedes palimpsest. So it was a parchment codex palimpsest, originally a Byzantine Greek copy of a compilation of Archimedes and other authors. It contained 2 works of Archimedes that were thought to have been lost, the Ostromechon and the Method of Mechanical Theorems. And the only surviving original Greek edition of this work on floating bodies. The first version of the compilation is believed to have been produced by, and so we go through this, but this was part of Tischendorf's material. So it's of interest, but I don't want to rabbit trail too far. But yeah, the biblical scholar Constantine von Tischendorf, he visited Constantinople in 1840s, and intrigued by the Greek mathematics visible on the palimpsest he found in a Greek Orthodox library, removed a leaf of it, which is now in the Cambridge University Library. So notice this guy's going around and he just, I don't know if he had permission to do that or... but anyway, that's an interesting thing. But we might revisit that. Tischendorf briefly visited the Netherlands in 1841 and England in 1842. In 1843, he visited Italy for 13 months. Now, someone has said that he had an audience with the Pope, which would be interesting. Before continuing on to Egypt, Sinai, and the Levant, returning via Vienna and Munich. So maybe I'll type in Tischendorf and the Pope. Okay. Yeah, so someone said here, okay, he's published Codex Ephraemi, finally came to Rome, and armed with letters of recommendation from Prince John of Saxony and the Archbishop of Paris, he presented himself at the Vatican. He was received by Pope Gregory the 16th, who had already heard of the young scholar's fame and received permission, given somewhat reluctantly, to do the collation work of Codex Vaticanus. However, after only 6 hours of work with the famous manuscripts, this permit was withdrawn. It is not known why the Vatican was so reluctant to let Tischendorf publish his Bible text, for which Christian theologians in all parts of the world were waiting. So it's quite amazing. You know, he was commissioned to go over Vaticanus by Pope Gregory the 16th. Then, after 6 hours of work, stopped from doing that, and then he went on from there to find Sinaiticus. So it's almost like a little bit too too convenient. Anyway, so apparently Pinto goes into this, but here's someone saying they've been slandering Tischendorf. So I'll just have a quick look at this. I don't want to get too bogged down. Chris Pinto has become his own unique version of David Barton. Just as David Barton reimagines the personal life of Thomas Jefferson to create an historical individual that is largely fiction, so too Chris Pinto reimagines the history behind Codex Sinaiticus to create a story that never happened. One of the key fundamental elements of Chris Pinto's documentary Tares Among the Wheat in the film, in which he reimagines the history of Codex Sinaiticus, is the slandering of Constantine von Tischendorf, the discovery of the Codex. Pinto presents him as a scumbag Jesuit sympathizer who is looking for a way to help subvert the Protestant Reformation and doctrine of sola scriptura, and he found it in the manuscript of Sinaiticus. And so so that would be an interesting article to go through, and probably after we really look at re-look at Pinto's material. And so the videos, Tares Among the Wheat, and I can't remember the other one. But yeah, there's been several videos that have come out by Chris Pinto, and he has his Noise of Thunder radio. So he's making a lot of claims about this as well. And so he is part of the team at Sinaiticus. .net. So we see we wish to recognize Chris Pinto of Adullam Films for the bold steps taken in the production of Tares Among the Wheat, spurring interest in many of these questions surrounding Codex Sinaiticus. So Sinaiticus.net is a collaborative effort of Stephen Avery, David Daniels, Mark Mitchie, and W.H. Ryer Hixson. And so so this has been put up there. So it's quite interesting, some of the comparisons and things like that. So we'll go through all this stuff and decipher what's being said. But I'm sure that this is what year is this done? This is done. I'm pretty sure this has been up for like 5 years. I would say it's probably very old nowadays, in a sense where Stephen Avery has constantly researched this. There's been quite a few more books written out about this, and also like he's at the moment with Kirk DeVitro working on some stuff. He's been working with other people. I jumped in for a while and did some work on Sirach. And so we're going to go through all this stuff later. But we want to continue through Tischendorf, having a look at what he did. But it's quite interesting that they didn't seem to mention that he went and saw the Pope. Maybe they do mention it later, but it's like, you'd think that would be quite an important thing to mention. I mean, even if someone who we know is, compromised, like Billy Graham or whatever, for them to go and see the Pope, but even the whole thing about him being allowed to check out Codex Vaticanus, but then banned from that. I mean, that should be here. Maybe it turns up later, but the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus Bible manuscripts. In 1844, Tischendorf travelled for the first time to St. Catherine's Monastery at the foot of Mount Sinai in Egypt, where he found a portion of what will be later hailed as the oldest complete known New Testament. Of many pages which were contained in an old wicker basket, the kind that the monastery hold in its visitors as customary in unsafe territories. So what they did is they put the basket down and they would drag people up, a bit like Paul, when he went down the wall in the basket sort of thing. So this was just because, if people came to rob the place, it's like, how are they going to get up? He was given 43 pages containing part of the Old Testament as a present. He donated these 43 pages to King Frederick Augustus II of Saxony. I'm like Saxonary. Sorry, I'll have a sip of water. I'll have a little bit of a breather. I've been talking flat out for 1 hour and 45 minutes. To honor him and to recognize his patronage as the founder of Tischendorf's journey. Tischendorf held a position as theological professor at Leipzig University, also under the patronage of Frederick Augustus II. Leipzig University put 2 of the leaves on display in 2011. Tischendorf reported in his 1865 book, One Werden and Other, it's got this title in German, translated into English in 1866 when were our Gospels written, in the section the discovery of the Sinaitic manuscript. What he found in a trash basket, 43 sheets of parchment of an ancient copy of the Greek Old Testament, reporting that the monks were using the trash to start fires, and Tischendorf, horrified, asked if he could have them. He deposited them at the University of Leipzig under the title Codex Frederico Augustinus, a name given in honor of his patron, Frederick Augustus II of Saxony, King of Saxony. The fragments were published in 1846, although Tischendorf kept the place of discovery a secret. Many have expressed skepticism at the historical accuracy of his report, saving a 1,500-year-old parchment from the flames. J. Rendell Harris referred to the story as a myth. Let's just read what he said here. What a run this myth has had, of a convent stove fed with parchment. Unhappily for the statement, the basket is still there, the regular part of the library furniture, and not a suggestion can be found that it was ever used to carry vellum books to the kitchen for burning. But any story will be believed against the Sinaitic monks, even that they made fires with parchment. And so that's one of the things, burning, but parchment isn't like paper. It's like burning plastic or something. It's just not, it's not good. The Tischendorf Lace book, see references, quotes that the librarian Kyrillios mentioned to Tischendorf that the contents of the basket had already twice been submitted to the fire. The contents of the baskets were damaged scriptures, the third filling apparently so cited by Tischendorf himself, see Tischendorf Lace book, Tischendorf's own account, In 1853, Tischendorf made a second trip to the Syrian monastery, but made no new discoveries. He returned a third time in January 1859 under the patronage of Tsar Alexander II of Russia, with the active aid of the Russian government to find more of Codex Frederico Augustinus or similar biblical texts. On the 4th of February, the last day of his visit, he was shown a text which he recognized as significant, the Codex Sinaiticus, a Greek manuscript of the complete New Testament and parts of the Old Testament dating to the 4th century. Tischendorf persuaded the monks to present the manuscripts to Tsar Alexander II of Russia. So here's a picture of him. At the cost of the Tsar, it was published in 1862 in 4 volumes. Those ignorant of the details of the discovery of Codex Sinaiticus accused Tischendorf of buying manuscripts from ignorant monastery librarians at low prices. Indeed, he was never rich, but he staunchly defended the rights of monks at St. Catherine's Monastery, where he persuaded them eventually to send the manuscript to the Tsar. This took approximately 10 years because the abbot of St. Catherine's had to be re-elected and confirmed in office in Cairo and in Jerusalem, and during those 10 years, no one in the monastery had the authority to hand over any documents. However, the documents were handed over in due course following a signed and sealed letter to Tsar Alexander II. Even so, the monks of Mount Sinai still display a receipt letter from Tischendorf promising to return the manuscript to them in the case that the donation cannot be done. This token letter had to be destroyed following the late issue of and it's a huge, long German word there, Skinkunz something. This donation act regulated the codex exchange with the Tsar, actually it's probably a Russian word, against 9,000 rubles and Romanian estate protection. The Tsar was seen as the protector of Greek Orthodox Christians. Thought lost since the Russian Revolution, the document has now resurfaced in St. Petersburg in 2003 and has also been long before commented upon by other scholars like Kurt Aland. The monastery has disputed the existence of the gift certificate since the British Library was named as a new owner of the codex. Now, following the late find of the gift certificate by the National Russian Library, the existence cannot be disputed in earnest. In 1869, the Tsar awarded Tischendorf the style of von Tischendorf as a Russian noble. I actually thought it was a German thing, but anyway, maybe it's both. 327 facsimile editions of the Codex were printed in Leipzig for the Tsar. Instead of a salary for the 3-year work of Tischendorf, the Tsar gave him 100 copies for reselling. In order to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of the traditional foundation of the Rus state in 862, with the publication of this most amazing find, supporting the production of the facsimile, all made with special print characters for each of the 4 scribes of the Codex Sinaiticus, was shift work and contributed to Tischendorf's early demise due to exhausting work for months, also during nights. Thus, the Codex found its way to the Imperial Library at St. Petersburg. When the 4th volume luxury edition of the Sinai Bible was completed in 1862, Tischendorf presented the original ancient manuscript to Emperor Alexander II. Meanwhile, the question of transferring the manuscript to the full possession of the Russian sovereign remained unresolved for some years. In 1869, the new Archbishop of Sinai, Callistratus, and the monastic community signed the official certificate presenting the manuscript to the Tsar. The Russian government in turn bestowed the monastery with 9,000 rubles and decorated the archbishop and some of the brethren with orders. In 1933, the Soviet government sold Codex Sinaiticus for £100,000 to the British Museum in London. The official certificate with signatures in Russian, French, Greek sections has been refound in St. Petersburg. So that's interesting. And what was also interesting, a bit of history, was Napoleon actually had access to Vaticanus. So he took Vaticanus, but he returned it and said it wasn't of any use, which is interesting. Okay, so we're still reading through some Tischendorf stuff. So Novum Testamentum Graece, publication with 21 editions. In the winter of 1849, the first edition of his great work, now titled Novum Testamentum Graece, and there's a bunch of Latin there, translated as Greek New Testament, the Ancient Witnesses, reviewed, preparations critical in many ways, containing canons of criticism, adding examples of their application that were applicable to students today. It has a basic rule: the text is only to be sought from ancient evidence, and especially from Greek manuscripts, but without neglecting the testimonies of versions and fathers. 1. A reading altogether particular to one or another ancient document is suspicious, as also is any, even if supported by a class of documents which seems to evince that it has originated in the revision of a learned man. 2. Readings, however well supported by evidence, are to be rejected when it is manifest or very probable that they have proceeded from the errors of copyists. 3. In parallel passages, whether of the New Testament, especially in the Synoptic Gospels, which ancient copyists continually brought into increased accordance. These testimonies are preferable, in which precise accordance of such parallel passages is not found, unless indeed there are important reasons to the contrary. 4, in discrepant readings that should be preferred, which may have given occasion to the rest, or which appears to comprise the elements of the others. 5, those readings must be maintained with accord with the New Testament Greek or the other particular style of each individual writer. So, okay, so that's I guess that's in the beginning of his Greek New Testament, part of his style of what he's done. And I can tell you, Tischendorf's Greek is very different to a lot of the other Greek of that era, even Westcott and Hort's. It's sort of all over the place. You'll look at a verse and it's like, even Westcott and Hort's, sometimes it's 2 or 3 words different. Tischendorf can be like a whole line omitted or added, or it's all over the place. Much different to even the critical texts of that era. In 1850 appeared his edition of Codex Atheismus. Okay, so let's have a quick look at this. Known as the Jarrow Codex, is considered the best preserved manuscript of the Latin of the Christian Bible. It was produced around 700 in northeast England at the Benedictine monk Wearmouth Jarrow Abbey. Okay, so it's a very old Vulgate text. Okay, so in 1854 it was corrected. So end of the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, 7th edition, 1887, and in 1852, among other works, his edition of Codex Claromontanus. So Codex Claromontanus, symbolized by those sigla, is a Greek-Latin diglot uncial manuscript of the New Testament written in uncial hand on vellum. The Greek and Latin texts are on facing pages. Thus, it is a diglot manuscript like Codex Bezae Cantabrigensis. The Latin text is designated by D traditional system or by 75. So yeah, interesting document. In 1859, he was named Professor Ordinarius of Theology and Biblical Paleography. This later professorship being specifically created for him, and another book of travel appeared in 1862. Tischendorf's Eastern journeys were rich enough in other discoveries to merit the highest praise. Okay, so he's visiting different people, looking at different manuscripts. He's doing all sorts of things. And what's interesting is that it looks like a purely ecumenical type of thing, where you have this guy who's a Protestant guy. He's working underneath a guy who is anti-Trinitarian. Now they go visit the Pope. He goes and visits the Pope and looks at Vaticanus. Then he goes and discovers Sinaiticus. And then he's using the patron of the Greek Orthodox Church, who happened to be Russian at the time. Because I guess the power of Russia, that would have been protecting, I guess, the Greek Empire. And it's involving the whole of Christendom, which is, it's pretty remarkable when you look at this. Like, just he's got all these contacts. How does he get these amazing contacts? How does he get these an audience with the Pope? I mean, just for doing some scholarly work. But perhaps this is all genuine, but I can see why some people reading this would go, man, it just sounds a little bit too good to be true. And I guess too, he's gone out to find a manuscript, and then it's a bit like when they went out to find the papyri. It was like later that day they found, the first day they were there, they found Matthew chapter 1, like in the sand, and it's like, hey, we've got Matthew 1, and it just seems a little bit too good to be true. You know what I mean? Like, but anyway, I'm just sharing my thoughts on that. That he just seems to be covering a lot of bases here. It's also not just the Greek New Testament; it's the Old Testament, it's the Septuagint, it's the Latin Vulgate. It's like a whole bunch of things. Besides his fame as a scholar, he was friend with both Robert Schumann. So let's have a look at who his friends are. I'll just shut some of these down. Robert Schumann, a German composer, pianist, and influential music critic. Doesn't really say much about spirituality. Looks like he was just so they said maybe he was bipolar, manic and depressive periods. He attempted suicide, and then he ended up in a mental asylum. Yeah, so, had a pretty wild time by the sounds of it. Maybe I can type in Tish. No, anyway, so that's one of his friends whom he corresponded, and Felix Mendelssohn. Okay, so who's this guy? Another piano player. So he's hanging around people who are artists, musicians. He dedicated a song to Tischendorf. His colleague Samuel Prideaux Tregelles wrote warmly of their mutual interest in textual scholarship. His personal library, purchased after his death, eventually came to the University of Glasgow, where a commemorative exhibition of books from his library was held in 1974 and can be accessed by the public. So this is Tregelles here. So he was instrumental in when Delitzsch apparently found the manuscript of Revelation that Erasmus used. He translated a lot of Delitzsch's German into English, persuaded a lot of people that the Textus Receptus needed to be overthrown. And so they concluded that Erasmus had been lying. So instead of Erasmus, when he's clearly talking about in Revelation chapter 22, verse 19, where it has the book of life, that he saw that there was a mistake there, they found this manuscript and said, no, this is the Reuchlin's manuscript that Erasmus used, and it was missing 6 entire verses, 136 words. So they're making out that Erasmus lied because he said there was only a few. It was only between, it was only like in verse 19. So they've created this whole story around that, which caused a lot of people to get confused about Erasmus. Was he lying? Was he not? Did he really back translate 6 complete verses? And then from there came the whole thing that he only had one manuscript. So any departure from that manuscript that Delitzsch found to the Textus Receptus was seen as just back translation from the Latin into there. And so it was just this ridiculous type of story that just got worse and worse. And now when you talk to people online about it, it's like they don't even know how to get to first base on this. But so, yeah, so he was friends with Tregelles, which wouldn't be surprising. And what you find is the Tyndale House text, they tend to go, oh, we go back to Tregelles. And so they don't go back to Westcott and Hort. Why don't they do that? Well, because they know there's issues with Westcott and Hort. So the NA28 are like, oh, well, we go back to Westcott and Hort. So, but I think inadvertently they both do. You know. So he wrote warmly of their mutual interest in textual scholarship, his personal library. So I already just read that. So his death, so he died in Leipzig in 1874, age 59. So then we've got a bit on Sinaiticus here, which we're in the middle of reading, so I won't reread all this. Or maybe I should, because it's good to sometimes have a summary. Okay. The Codex Sinaiticus contains a 4th century manuscript of the New Testament text. 2 other Bibles of similar age exist, although they are less complete, Codex Vaticanus and the Vatican, in the Vatican Library, and Codex Alexandrinus, currently owned by the British Library. The Codex Sinaiticus is deemed by some to be the most important surviving New Testament manuscript, as no older manuscript is as nearly complete as the Codex. The Codex can be viewed in the British Library in London or as a digitized version on the internet. Tischendorf's motivation. Throughout his life, Tischendorf sought old biblical manuscripts as he saw it as his task to give theology a Greek New Testament which was based on the oldest possible scriptures. He intended to be as close as possible to the original sources. Tischendorf's greatest discovery was in the monastery of St. Catherine on the Sinai Peninsula, which he visited in May 1844 and again in 1853 and in 1859. So these dates, even though I'm sort of, it's probably like the 4th time I've mentioned it, it's good to drum these dates into our mind because sometimes we need an anchor point. And so, 1844, 1853, and 1859. So these are the 3 visits that he's had to Mount Sinai. In 1862, Tischendorf published the text of the Codex Sinaiticus for the 1000th anniversary of the Russian monarchy in both an illustrious 4-volume facsimile edition and in less costly text edition to enable all scholars to have access to the Codex. Tischendorf pursued a constant course of editorial labors, mainly on the New Testament, until he was broken down by overwork in 1873. His motive, as explained in a publication on Tischendorf's letter by Professor Kreisfried Beatrich, was to prove scientifically that the words of the Bible were trustfully transmitted over centuries. That's interesting, because it's proven the exact opposite. His work has destroyed a lot of people's confidence in the Bible, and so that's why a lot of people are very suspect of this document. Okay, so it's interesting that he seems to have died. It says mainly on the New Testament until he was broken down by overwork. Okay, so anyway, that's what they're claiming. Okay, so let's look at his works. His magnum opus was the critical edition of the New Testament, the great edition of which the text and apparatus appears in 1869 and 1872. So his 8th edition was in 1872. Okay. I just know that because I'm always putting that into my website at the bottom of each scripture, bottom of each page, 1872, Tischendorf's edition. And that's one of the good things about me doing the Textus Receptus website, the wiki style site that I've got, is I'm constantly going and correcting things and adding things, and dates like that just after a while just become solidified in your mind. And so it does help me. It's become like a part of my brain. I'll forget things. I'll even forget that I've done a whole article and then go back and I'll go back to the website to start an article, and I'm like, oh, I've already done this 5 years ago. I just forgot, It was called by himself Edito 8, but this number is raised to 20 or 21 if mere reprints from stereotype plates and the minor editions of his great critical texts are included. Posthumous prints bring the total to 45. 4 main recensions of Tischendorf's text may be distinguished, dating respectively from his editions 1841, 49, 59. So that's his 7th edition, 69 to 72, his 8th edition. The edition of 1849 may be regarded as historically the most important from the mass of new critical material it used. That of 1859 is distinguished from Tischendorf's other editions by coming nearer to the received text. In the 8th edition, the testimony of the Sinaitic manuscript received probably too great weight. The readings of the Vatican manuscript were given with more exactness and certainty than had been possible in earlier editions, and the editor had also the advantage of using the published labors of his catalogue and friend Samuel Prideaux Tregelles. So yeah, Tregelles had published certain things, and so he was able to use those as well. Of relatively lesser importance was Tischendorf's work on the Greek Old Testament, his edition of the Roman texts with the variants of the Alexandrian manuscript, the Codex Ephraemi, and the Frederico Augustinus, was of service when it appeared in 1850, but being stereotyped was not greatly improved in subsequent issues. Its imperfections, even within the limited field it covers, may be judged by the aid of Everhard Nessel's appendix to the 6th issue. Okay, so Everhard Nessel, who became the founder of the Nestle texts, Nestle Alarm text, so he was already working on other manuscripts and things like that before he had worked on his Greek New Testament. Besides this, may be mentioned editions of a New Testament Apocrypha. So it's in 1851. or the Book of Acts, the Acta Apostolorum Apocrypha, 1851. So there were other editions of these type of things in 53, 76, and 66. The various minor writings, partly of an apologetic character, such as Juan Worden, Uncia Evangelion Furfast, when were our Gospels written? 65, and so a bunch of other things there, which I won't go into because most of it's in German. So facsimiles of manuscripts. So he had Codex Ephremi Syri Rescriptus, so that was in 1843, and so he had I think the same thing in 1845, and then his Notia Editianus Codices Biblorum Sinaitic in 1850, and then Anecdota Sacra et Profana in 1861. So I probably won't read through all these Latin ways of saying things because it just sounds ridiculous. But editions of the Novum Testamentum Graece, 62, 78, and 59. Editu Octava. So Octava is usually just a smaller handheld edition. You got the Novum Testamentum Graece, so in 69. That was the Gospels. So then he's got Acts through Revelation, 1872, Prologema. And so these editions are in 84, 90, and 94. So obviously after he died. The Septuagint. And so he's done an edition of that in Volume 1 and Volume 2. So his publications continued. Doctrina Pauli, so that's in Latin. So that was in 1839. It just says Google. So I guess someone tried to put a link to that. But yeah, these would be interesting just to have a look at and try to find out, try to gauge where this guy's at. So another German book in 1839, Disputatio de Christo, 1839. And there was another one in 1840. Another one in 1840. So he's written quite a lot. So he's prolific in writing about lots of things about the New Testament. 1840 again, Novum Testamentum Graece, 1842, A Cane Diatheke, 1842 again. So he's using Stephani and Griesbacchi. So Stephanus and Griesbach. 1843, he's looking at other things. Because most of this is in German and Latin, it's sort of hard to do this live, but I'm just going through 1846, a few other books. Okay, so then he printed Codex Frederico Augustinus, which is the old name for Codex Sinaiticus. 1847, another book. Another one, 1847. So yeah, I won't read through all that. But you can see he is prolific in his writings, which is very interesting. Cooperation. So he's written some things with other people. Okay, so it looks like they've gone through the Elzevirs, Napi, Shalozzi, Ruckmani. So it's Ruckman, Nikai, Stephanus. So yeah, he's worked on something that is like the New Testament. Some other things, mostly sort of like Greek New Testaments, working on them as well. He was a second author. Have a look at this. This is really interesting. Actually, second author. So he's got Ezra Abbott, but he's already died by then. Okay. So Ezra Abbott was a Unitarian. the late Professor Tischendorf, or Unitarian Review and Religious Magazine. Caspar and A. Gregory, Tischendorf. Okay, so they're writing biographies. I'm not sure why it has second author. Anyway, let's move on. Bunch of footnotes, references, external links. Well, and you can look at most of his works online. I guess, you know, critical text people, this would just be you know, a gold mine for them to go through all this sort of stuff. And someone like Dan Wallace, you know. So yeah, and even back then, a lot of the introductions and everything, it's all in Latin. So yeah, works by Tischendorf at CCEL. So that's very interesting. Comparison of the 8th edition with other manuscripts. That would show you how different it is, because there's quite a lot of difference. Okay, so 1 John 5, parallel side by side display. Yeah, like you see things like this. It's just like, oh, that's the Comma Johannium, that's why. But like, yeah, verse 13, bang, 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 missing, you know, changed. So that's even the Westcott Hort text. I wonder why that's so prevalent. Oh no, that's the TR. That's Westcott Hort plus Tischendorf. Okay, that's confusing. Let's bail from there. So we've got this here, his works. Origin of the 4 Gospels. Where were our Gospels written? So well, he's obviously spent his whole life around the New Testament. Anyway, yeah, so there's quite a lot of his work online. So you can spend a fair bit of time going through all that. So we've gone for 2 hours and 22 minutes. But I do want to just, maybe I can go through Uspensky and who he is, because these are characters that are going to constantly get brought up. So we've seen that Tischendorf, you know, he's a prolific writer. He's a very interesting guy. But like a lot of people, you can be intellectual, but you can be completely wrong. And so we believe he was wrong about the New Testament text. I'm just going to answer this comment here. I think the YouTube video titled Tischendorf's Big Mistake by Chick Tracks made an interesting case how the way Tischendorf collected folia of the Sinaiticus indicates he was fraudulent. Okay, so we'll be going through all of those videos. We'll examine all of them. So eventually, we don't want to rush anything. We want to get all the characters down, all the places down. There's a lot of differences diminishing Christ's deity. Yeah, that's interesting because of Wiener's influence. That would be that could be like a spiritual type of transference of spirit there, you know, a transference of doubtfulness against the Trinity. Okay, so Uspensky is an Archimandrite used. I'll open it up. It's hard to read. Like this. So he's sort of like a bishop in the Eastern Orthodox Church. Okay, so got the very fancy clothing happening. So let's look up who Uspensky is, because he gets brought up quite a lot. So he lived between 1804 and 1885. So he was also Constantine. So you got Constantine Alexandrovich Uspensky, and you got Constantine Simonides, and you got Constantine von Tischendorf. Constantine was a very popular name. Well, I guess, Constantinople. He was a Russian Empire traveler, theologian, Orientalist, archaeologist, and Byzantinologist, founder of the Russian ecclesiastical mission in Jerusalem, and also discovered several ancient codices. In latter years, he was auxiliary bishop of Chergin. So it's in Kiev, so in the Ukraine, when Ukraine was Russia. Life. Konstantin Uspensky was born 8th of September 1804 in Kostroma, Russian Empire. He finished religious school in 1818, and 4 years after he finished his studies at the Theological Seminary at Kostroma. Now, the reason I'm talking about Uspensky is, let's just go back to our main article. So he visited the monastery and he took some leaves back with him to Russia. So this is one of the key things that people are saying, that some of the, because there's different scattered parts of Codex Sinaiticus around the place, when they examine some of these, they feel that some of these have been tampered with to be made to look older, where some of the pieces that Uspensky took look fresh and younger. But they can be, you can have one page on one side and Uspensky's taken the next page and it looks fresh, but this other one looks old. And so that's why they're saying, it's been stained, it's been made to look old. It's been altered. So that's one of the main claims. And so that's why I wanted to look into Uspensky as well. So it says he visited the monastery and the codex was shown to him together with leaves which Tischendorf had not seen. Okay. And so in 1829, he finished his studies at St. Petersburg Theological Academy. That same year, he became a priest and received the title of Porphyrus. I might just get the proper Russian way of saying that. Translate. Maybe I can just translate it straight into Russian.
Porphyr.
Porphyrus. Okay. In 1834, he became an archimandrite in Odessa, so one of the religious guys. It was in Odessa where he became interested in Oriental Orthodoxy and learned modern Greek and Italian. He traveled to Palestine in 1842 and became head of the newly established Russian Orthodox ecclesiastical mission in Jerusalem. In 1847, which he headed until 1854. In 1845 and 46, he traveled to Mount Athos in Greece and Mount Sinai in Egypt. He saw Codex Sinaiticus in St. Catherine's Monastery in 1844, 1 year after Constantine von Tischendorf's first visit. This is why it's important. So Constantine von Tischendorf has gone and seen this manuscript, saw him, they're about to burn it and all this. And so Uspensky is there the next year. Okay. After a visit to the monastery of Mar Saba, he took a codex which was later named after him, the Uspensky Gospels. So that's interesting. Didn't know about that one. I think we did mention it though. They are the oldest and known dated manuscript of the New Testament. The oldest dated one. So they had actually written a date on it. Okay, interesting. And he brought it together with other manuscripts such as Codex Porphyrianus to Russia for pre-iconoclast encaustic icons brought by Uspensky from Sinai are still preserved in Kiev, Ukraine. So there was the iconoclast had happened, and people were getting rid of idols, paintings, all sorts of things. So in these monasteries, some of these things were preserved. So he was grabbing them and bringing them into Russia. So Russia, Ukraine. Well, sometimes Kiev was the capital of Russia. So the Rus people, they had their capital there. They had their capital in Moscow. So there's many different places where they had their capital. In 1869, he received a doctoral degree in Greek philosophy. Uspensky died on 19th of April 1885 and was buried in the Novospassky Monastery in Moscow. So here are all his works. So these are all in Russian. And a few citations, general bibliography, external links. You can look at his collections. So, yeah, doesn't look like it's there anymore. Maybe it was. So anyway, that's just a short one on Uspensky, but he'll be brought up quite frequently. So we did get down to Simonides. So I'm just wondering whether I just leave Simonides for next time, or if I do a quick brief through, maybe up to where it's considered a modern day forgery or something like that. And I won't go through and go through all the details, but I'll just read through it. If we get time, or if I feel like I can continue on, I'll go through some stuff. So on the 13th of September, 1862, Constantine Simonides, 1820 to 1890, skilled in calligraphy and with a controversial background with manuscripts, made the claim in print, the Manchester Guardian, so this is the Guardian newspaper, the completely woke newspaper nowadays, that he had written. It's sort of a shame. The Guardian actually did quite a lot of really good investigative work when, like, the Gulf War was on, Afghanistan War, and spoke a lot of truth about those things. And now they've just become just gutter trash, So he had written the Codex himself as a 19-year-old boy in 1839 in the Panteleimonos Monastery at Athos. So this is Saint Panteleimon Monastery. Okay, so this is at Mount Athos. So he made this claim in The Guardian that he had written it as a 19-year-old boy. Okay. Constantine von Tischendorf, who worked with numerous Bible manuscripts, was known as somewhat flamboyant and had ambitiously sought money from several royal families for his ventures, who had indeed funded his trips. Simonides had a somewhat obscure history, as he claimed he was at Mount Athos in the years preceding Tischendorf's contact, making the claim at least plausible. Simonides also claimed his father had died, and the invitation to Mount Athos came from his uncle, a monk there. But subsequent letters to his father were found among his possessions at his death. Simonides claimed the false nature of the document in the Manchester Guardian. In an exchange of letters among scholars and others at the time, Henry Bradshaw, a British librarian known to both men, defended the Tischendorf Finer Codex Sinaiticus, casting aside the accusations of Simonides, which later have been disproved. Okay. Since Bradshaw was a social hub among many diverse scholars of the day, his aiding of Tischendorf was given much weight. Simonides died shortly after, and the issue lay dormant for many years. In answer to Simonides in Allegeme Zeitung, December 1862. Tischendorf noted only in the New Testament were there many differences between it and in all other manuscripts. Henry Bradshaw, a biographer, combated the claims of Constantine Simonides in a letter to the Manchester Guardian, 26th of January 1863. Bradshaw argued that Codex Sinaiticus, brought by Tischendorf from the Greek monastery of Mount Sinai, was not a modern forgery or written by Simonides. The controversy seems to regard the misplaced use of the word fraud or forgery, since it may have been a repaired text. The Codex of the Sinaiticus, based upon Origen's Hexapla, a text which has been rejected for centuries because of its lineage from Eusebius, who introduced Arian doctrine into the courts of Constantine I and II. Not every scholar and church ministers was delighted about the Codex find. Burgon, a supporter of the Textus Receptus, actually he was a supporter of a traditional text, not the Textus Receptus. There is a difference. Traditional text is basically the majority text. He was a majority text guy. He's probably one of the main founders of the majority text movement. He suggested that Codex Sinaiticus, as well as Codices Vaticanus and Codex Beza, were the most corrupt documents extant. Each of these three codices clearly exhibits a fabricated text. It is a result of arbitrary and reckless recension. The two most weighty of these codices, Aleph and B, so Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, he likens to the two false witnesses of Matthew 26:60. So that's interesting. So that's Dean Burgon saying that in 1883 in the Revision Revised. However, independent discoveries of other fragments of the Codex in recent history, see below, prove its authenticity and disprove all theories of it being a forgery. Okay, so I don't know who's written this one, but just because they found a new part of it, in Mount Sinai, doesn't mean that proves it. You know what I mean? It's like the whole. Simonides is saying the whole thing was written by him. So the recent history in the early 20th century, Vladimir Benishevich, from 1874 to 1938, discovered parts of three more leaves of the Codex in the bindings of other manuscripts in the library of Mount Sinai. Benishevich went on 3 occasions to the monastery, 1907, 1908, and 1911, but does not tell when or from which book these were recovered. These leaves were also acquired for St. Petersburg, where they remain. For many decades, the Codex was preserved in the Russian National Library. So that would be interesting to see what other books they were bound to. And so anyway, that's another rabbit trail. For many decades, the Codex was preserved in the Russian National Library. In 1933, the Soviet Union sold the Codex to the British Museum. After 1973, the British Library, for £100,000 raised by public subscription, worth $7.6 million in 2003. After coming to Britain, it was examined by Skeet and Milne using an ultraviolet lamp. Okay, so that's interesting. So this type of technology has been used. In May 1979, during restoration work, the monks of St. Catherine's Monastery discovered a room beneath the St. George Chapel, which contained many parchment fragments. Kurt Aland and his team from the Institute for New Testament Textual Research were the first scholars who were invited to analyze, examine, and photograph these new fragments of the New Testament in 1982. Among these fragments were 12 complete leaves from Sinaiticus, 11 leaves from the Pentateuch, and 1 leaf from the Shepherd of Hermes. Together with these leaves, 67 Greek manuscripts and New Testaments have been found. Uncials 0276 and 296 and some minuscules. In June 2005, a team of experts from the United Kingdom, Europe, Egypt, Russia, and United States undertook a joint project to produce a new digital edition of the manuscript involving all 4 holding libraries. A series of other studies was announced. And so people were all getting excited about this. This will include the hyperspectral imaging. So let's just have a quick look at that. Hyperspectral imaging collects and processes information from across the electromagnetic spectrum. The goal of hyperspectral imaging is to obtain the spectrum for each pixel in the image of a scene, with the purpose of finding objects, identifying materials, or deleting processes. These are there are 3 general types of spectral images, etc. So it's just a way of photographing these manuscripts. To photograph the manuscripts to look for hidden information such as erased or faded text. This is to be done in cooperation with the British Library. Okay. More than 1/4 of the manuscript was made publicly available at the Sinaiticus website. Okay. On the 23rd of July 2008, on the 6th of July 2009, 800 more pages of the manuscript were made available, showing over half of the entire text. Although the entire text was intended to be shown by that date. The complete document is now available online in digital form and available for scholarly study. The online version has a fully transcribed set of digital images, including amendments to the text, and 2 images of each page, with both standard lighting and raked lighting to highlight the texture of the parchment. And so when you go to the website, you can see they've got the usual thing where you're looking at the manuscript, but then they have it where they put the light right down next to the book. So you can see the waves, the page, and some lumps and things like that. And so if you go to Sinaiticus.org, you can look at that. Prior to the 1st of September 2009, the University of the Arts London PhD student Nicholas Saris discovered the previously unseen fragment of the Codex in the library of St. Catherine's Monastery. It contains the text of the book of Joshua 1:10. Okay, so yeah, so we've actually nearly finished this article, but what I think I will do, because we've gone to the Simonides section. Okay, so what I will do is I'll chip back through some of this stuff, even though most of it's pretty self-explanatory. So maybe I don't need to do that. So I think, because it's not like I'm not going to go back and look at Simonides with some of the other stuff we're looking at. So maybe what I'll do is I'll start off next time with present location, impact on biblical scholarship. I might have a look at some of the footnotes, not too many of them. But then we might get straight into some of the issues. And so maybe I'll look it up whether we might even go through the first material of Chris Pinto. We might even examine the debate that Chris Pinto had with James White, because we want to look at everything as it's chronologically seen as well. We don't want to just talk about stuff today because there is a build-up to what we have today. And So I want to sort of go through like Chris Pinto's stuff. Then I want to go through the Sinaiticus.net stuff, like with Stephen Avery and all the rest of it. And then I want to go through the Chick Tracks material, and sort of go through Elijah Hixson stuff and James Snap, and then sort of bring it to today. So in amongst all that, we're going to be looking at stuff in the past. We're going to be looking at new concepts and new ideas, because see, sometimes people have a very good concept and idea, but then someone comes along and it's like, oh, they've debunked it, but they haven't really debunked it. And so people stop talking about it, but it actually is something that still needs to be done or still needs to be thought about. Or sometimes they've debunked something that needed debunking. And it's like, oh, okay, I can see where they're getting at there. Yes, that was wrong to think along those lines. Let's look at some other alternatives. And so anyway, we're going to continue our study on Codex Sinaiticus in part 4. I'm not sure when I'll do that. Helg says, Simonides now, please, begging for information about Simonides. Thanks for joining us, guys. God bless you. And I'll continue doing these. Hopefully I can do one a week. That'll be great, because then by the end of the year, I've got 52 of these that anyone who wants to know about this issue, they can just put on a playlist and listen through a few days of video and go, yeah, that's helpful. So hopefully we can move away from the Wikipedia style issues, and we can get into some of the real nitty gritty. That'd be great. And so, and also, we'll probably go through some of Stephen Avery's material as well. I mean, Stephen Avery's pretty much the one who's documenting a lot of this stuff behind the scenes. Now, if you don't know about Stephen Avery's website, he's got Pure Bible Forum here. And if you just go to like new posts, 2 minutes ago, he's on here. Luke 1:35 matches the Islamist text of Son of Gods, so they're wrong to say they have no such belief. And so, yeah, that's just today. He's going through those issues. Tischendorf praised by Carlo, by this guy in Rome. So interesting. So yeah, we'll scour through his material. So that was written in 2021. Who these people are. They're getting accolades by the Roman Catholics. Does Kurt Youngkin push back the Sinaiticus date by Eusebius canons? Conflation and corruption and transmission, history, theories, ancestry. So that's interesting. Okay, well, I think I'll leave it there. Thanks for joining us, guys. God bless you. And I'll put that website into the comments there. So if you want to go there and check out Stephen Avery's material, you can become 100 times more versed than you would be before looking at this issue. He has so much material on here. It's quite amazing. So anyway, I feel tempted to just keep going, but I won't, because I know I'm so tired and I'm starting to slur. So anyway, God bless you guys, and we'll see you next time.